Last week I spoke to you about learning to hope as Mary hopes and to hope in Mary, especially in times when we are at the point of despair. I often ask myself why hope is so precious to Mary and why she keeps inviting us to hope in her. And I'm gradually learning the answer. To go on hoping in Mary despite the fact that things become more difficult, despite the fact that each time the evidence before us contradicts what we expected, means believing more in Mary than, as I said last week, the evidence at hand. It means constantly turning to Mary and giving Mary another chance. After all, what mother, discovering that her child is sure she is going to receive a certain gift on her birthday, that the mother hadn't even thought of, wouldn't rush if she could so as not to disappoint her? I know that as human beings we may fear and not want people to put too much hope in us because we know our own limits, and therefore, no matter how much we try, we cannot always live up to what others may expect of us. But this is not true of Mary. Mary doesn't have such problems. Far from being put out by the fact that we can place too much hope in her, she desires this and waits for it. Perhaps there's something you ardently hoped for. Hope that Mary would intervene, and nothing happened. Well, the next time you hoped again, and nothing happened. Things were just as before, despite all your supplications and tears to her. Maybe despite some indications that this time Mary would listen to you. Yet you still hoped. You went on hoping again and again. You never ceased to hope right to the end. What you may not realize is that you had become, by your persistence, an accomplice of hope, and that you have been granted a greater grace than the one you asked for. And that is the grace to hope in Mary. In 1988, my older brother Charlie was diagnosed with AIDS. For 2 years, he suffered from the ravages of this disease. Gradually, over the march of months, it devoured his muscles, his body fat, his appetite, and eventually his breathing. It also gave rise to painful emotions like fear, sadness, emptiness, and anger. While he loved me as his brother, he found it difficult at times to welcome the priest who yearned to bring him the healing power of Christ. He was angry at God, and he would constantly ask me, "Why did God do this to me?" In the face of such anger and rejection, all I could do was quietly pray the rosary and ask Mary to open the door of his heart to Jesus, the one I knew who was knocking. One week, in the second year of his agony, my parents and I were caring for him at his home in Dallas, Texas. His pain was very intense. He was 6'3", and he now weighed a mere 80 pounds. The AIDS had diminished every ounce of his body mass to mere skin and bones. Each night, before we went to bed, we would turn the hallway light on outside his room just to let him know we were there for him in his darkness. And every night I would wake up at 3 a.m. and go into his room and place a few drops of artificial morphine under his tongue to help ease his pain. On the third night, I went into his room. My brother Charlie was awake, which was rather unusual. He said he had been awake all night, gazing at a shadow on the wall across from his bed. It was the shadow of a single white orchid plant mounted on a slender cross trellis that had been used to support its long, gnarled stem. My father had bought the orchid plant for him that day and quietly placed it on his bureau that afternoon while he was sleeping. The light from the hallway had created a shadow of the orchid on the wall in front of his bed. My brother asked me to look at the shadow and to tell him what I saw. I looked. I saw a cross, and at the center, the bud of the orchid appeared as a drooping head, and its protruding stem looked like a bent knee. I warned him he would not approve of my interpretation. He insisted. I said, I see Jesus hanging on the cross. And he said, I see Jesus too. And then he began to cry. There is God, Philip. There in that shadow is God, whom I could not see. There is his love on the wall speaking to me. I want to be forgiven, Philip. I want to be free. For the next 2 hours, I listened to my brother confess his life to me, his sins, his sorrows, his fears, his gratitude, his joy, his hope. And when he had finished his confession, and I had absolved him, my prodigal brother said to me, Philip, let's celebrate. And we did. And we did. At 5 o'clock that morning, I picked him up out of his bed, and I put his weakened body in a wheelchair, and I put a coat over his shoulders, and a hat, a woolen hat on his head, and a pair of flip-flops on his feet. And we went to Dunkin' Donuts and devoured the fatted calf, a chocolate eclair. 2 months later, my brother Charlie died peacefully on Friday, May 1st, 1990, at 12 a.m. in the morning. For my family, it was our Good Friday. For my brother Charlie, it was his Easter Sunday. I never imagined that my brother would open his heart to Jesus at the time and in the way it happened. But I will say that in praying the rosary, sometimes in some remote corner of my heart, I had this quiet assurance that in the face of such tragedy, something good was going to happen. Something new would come about. Actually, I now realize that it was more than just a feeling. It was grace. It was hope. I had become an accomplice to hope. The great thing that Mary did on Calvary was that she hoped beneath the cross. Beneath the shadow of the cross, she helped my brother to believe in the mercy of God and granted me a much greater grace, the grace to hope in her always.